I sat on the edge of the pier as the sun began its slow descent, the sky burning with the kind of colors that make you wonder if the world has been holding its breath just to paint this moment. The water below me whispered and shimmered in the fading light, each ripple carrying a memory I hadn't visited in years. I wasn't here for the scenery, though it was impossible not to notice. I was here for the silence, the kind that presses against your chest and lets you feel everything you've ever tried to hide. In moments like this, the noise of the world falls away, and you can almost hear the truth of your own existence humming beneath the surface. That hum had been calling me for decades, through the losses, the empty rooms, the applause and the isolation, and tonight, I finally gave it permission to speak. Society has a quiet way of telling seniors to disappear. It starts subtly. The younger people stop asking for your opinion. The world begins to move at a speed that feels alien, and suddenly, the mirror reflects a version of yourself that is meant to shrink into the background. Step carefully, they say. Don't make waves. Fade into the wallpaper. It's the standard script, and for most, it's comforting enough to follow it, but not for everyone. There are few who feel the pull of something else, a restlessness that refuses to bow to age, that looks at the ticking clock not as a limitation but as a challenge. That's who I've been tracking in my own mind, the ones I've started to think of as the elite 1% of seniors. Not because they have more money, more fame, or more opportunity. Not because they still move like they did in their 20s, but because they have chosen, consciously, to keep stretching into life in ways that feel dangerous, exhilarating, and deeply alive. I've seen it in small, almost imperceptible gestures. The way a woman in her 70s takes a last-minute trip across the country to visit an old friend she hasn't spoken to in decades. The way a man leans into an unfamiliar hobby, despite failing repeatedly, just to see what he is capable of. Now, the way someone dares to fall in love again, knowing the heartbreak is as real as the joy. These are acts that fly under the radar, invisible to the world, but they carry a weight most people would never recognize. They are the prelude to something radical, something quietly revolutionary, and I have to admit, there's a certain thrill in watching them. Not the kind of thrill that comes from applause or recognition, but a subtler kind, one that hums through your veins and makes the hair on the back of your neck stand on end. There's a feeling that something is about to shift, that these choices, taken in silence, are the first drops in a storm the world isn't yet ready to see. I leaned back on my hands, letting the cool wood press against my palms, and thought about what it means to be one of them or to even aspire to be. It's not easy. It's terrifying. It asks you to confront every fear you've spent a lifetime constructing walls around. And yet, it promises something that few ever get to experience, the knowledge that the final chapters of life do not have to be spent shrinking or fading. They can be bold. They can be luminous. They can, if you dare, rewrite everything you've been taught about what it means to grow old. As the sun dipped lower, spilling gold across the horizon, I realized that this moment, the quiet, the anticipation, the almost unbearable weight of possibility was exactly the space where the first step must be taken. And what that step truly is, well, that is a story that will not be whispered in living rooms or taught in classrooms. It is reserved for those willing to stare into the abyss of age and say, not with fear, but with fierce intention, I am still here. I am still alive, and I will not fade. I remember the first time I understood the weight of absence. It wasn't a grand scene with flashing lights or cameras, though by then I had been on plenty of sets where the world seemed to pause for me. No, this was quieter, more intimate, and infinitely more brutal. It was 1993, and the phone call came in the middle of the night. River was gone, just like that, vanished from a world we both thought we understood, leaving a silence so dense it felt like it could crush me. I drove through streets that had once felt alive with possibility and now seemed like a maze of ghosts, each neon sign a mocking echo of the life that kept moving, while mine felt suspended. That night I learned painfully that external success, the fame, the money, the accolades could not shield you from the void left by someone you loved. Loss has a way of rearranging your interior landscape. For some, it is a prompt to retreat, to shrink, to protect themselves from further hurt. I watched friends take this path and felt a strange mix of envy and dread. But a few, the ones who will someday become the one, choose differently. They step into the pain, carry it like a lantern rather than a weight, and let it illuminate the corners of their own lives that had been shadowed by fear or complacency. You can see it in their eyes, in the way they respond to ordinary moments with extraordinary presence. I had to learn to see it for myself. 6 years later, life tested me again in ways I had never imagined. Jennifer and I were expecting our first child, and I had begun to imagine a future that wasn't defined by the next film or the next career milestone, but by someone else's laughter, their first words, the subtle rhythms of family life. I named her Ava. I would lie awake at night, tracing my hand across Jennifer's belly, speaking softly, telling her the adventures I hoped she would have, the life I wished I could show her. And then the doctors delivered news that shattered those dreams with the kind of precision only reality can. She would not survive. I held her anyway, a tiny bundle of possibility that existed for mere moments, yet left a scar and a gift all at once. In that fragility, I learned a lesson the world rarely teaches: to feel fully, to love fully, even when the stakes are unbearable. The grief that followed could have swallowed me, and for a time, it almost did. But grief, when faced, has a way of carving new pathways through the soul. It forced me to confront the difference between existing and living, between protecting yourself from pain and opening yourself to the fullness of life. I realized that the people who refuse to shrink in the face of loss, the ones who embrace it and carry it forward, are the ones who develop a rare kind of courage. It is the courage of the elite one, not measured in accolades or outward triumphs, but in the willingness to feel, to grow, and to remain fully alive despite the pain that life insists on giving. By the time I turned 60, I had spent years walking the line between survival and authenticity, and I had begun to notice something extraordinary about those who refuse to disappear into age. They move quietly, almost invisibly, but their lives carry a resonance that reaches farther than most will ever know. They take losses and turn them into insight. They take fear and turn it into daring. They take what society tells them is their limitation, age, fragility, expectation, and turn it into a radical declaration of presence. I wanted to become one of them, and I realized, if I wanted to take that step, I could not wait any longer. By the time I reached my early 60s, I had learned enough to know that sitting in quiet reflection was not enough. Observing life from the sidelines, even with all its lessons and scars, still left a certain hollowness. That's when I began to notice the subtle but extraordinary ways some seniors refused to obey the rules society set for them. They were not flashy, not loud, not out for recognition. They were quietly radical. They traveled alone, started new projects, learned instruments they had abandoned decades ago, or enrolled in courses they had once dismissed as too advanced. And in the process, they radiated something I had been chasing my entire life: presence. I remember the first time I tried to step into that world of curiosity myself. Alexandra had invited me to a small art exhibit, something unconventional, experimental, even unsettling. I went without expectation, and immediately I felt the stirrings of something I hadn't felt in years: genuine wonder. The paintings were not perfect. The sculptures did not conform to any rule I knew, and yet, they made sense to me in ways that were raw and unfiltered. I found myself asking questions, not for show or to impress, but because I actually wanted to know. How did the artists think? How did they see the world differently than I did? And then something remarkable happened. I began to notice the spark in myself again, the same spark I had lost in the years of grief and routine. Curiosity, I realized, is a form of rebellion. It is a declaration that you refuse to shrink, that you refuse to accept that the story of your life is finished. I watched other seniors in those moments, some trying pottery for the first time, some learning digital photography, some walking into a lecture hall with the same trepidation a teenager might feel on the first day of school. And yet, none of them stopped. They persisted through awkward failures, through the uncertainty of being beginners again. That willingness to start over, to embrace the awkwardness, to stay vulnerable, is what separates the 1% from the rest. It is not in the avoidance of failure, but in the courage to show up anyway. I took up painting that year. My first canvases were laughable misplaced strokes, awkward proportions, colors that clashed violently. But each mistake was a revelation, each failure a lesson in presence and humility. The process demanded that I abandon certainty, that I relinquish the illusion of control I had clung to for decades. And as I painted, I began to understand what curiosity truly does. It pulls you out of the small cage of comfort, it stretches you, and it forces your heart and mind to remain active, engaged, alive. The elite 1% of seniors I observed were doing more than learning new skills, they were actively choosing to expand their capacity for life. They laughed at fear, experimented with joy, and treated their remaining years as an uncharted territory full of possibility. And slowly, I began to sense that the step before 2026, the radical act I had been chasing and thought for so long, was rooted in the same impulse: curiosity, courage, and the refusal to fade. To step into that unknown, fully alive, without apology, without waiting for the world to grant permission. That night, as I left the exhibit and walked along the quiet streets, I felt a tremor of anticipation. I was beginning to understand that the first move toward becoming one of the 1% is deceptively simple, yet profoundly difficult. You must allow yourself to be a beginner again, to risk failure, to be seen as imperfect, to feel the thrill of the unknown. And in that vulnerability, the world feels wider, the possibilities richer, and the self more alive than it has in decades. Even as I began to explore curiosity, I quickly discovered that stepping into life wasn't just about trying new things or chasing small adventures, it was about confronting the walls I had spent decades building around my heart. For years, I had perfected routines, mastered deflection, and insulated myself from the raw, unpredictable intensity of living fully. I had convinced myself that control was safety, that predictability meant protection. But in reality, it was a slow suffocation, a quiet exile from the very experiences that make us human. Those walls had kept out the pain, yes, but they had also kept out joy, intimacy, wonder, and connection. I remember one afternoon, sitting alone in a sunlit room filled with books I had collected over the years, and feeling a sudden pang of loneliness, sharper than any grief I had previously known. It wasn't a dramatic, all-consuming grief like the loss of Ava or Jennifer. It was quieter, insidious, a creeping awareness that I had been watching life from behind a glass wall while it unfolded all around me. And I realized, with a kind of stark clarity, that the people who refused to fade the one were the ones willing to knock down those walls, brick by brick, even when the labor hurt. It began in small ways. I would ask a stranger for directions, not because I needed them, but to engage, to feel seen, and to see them in return. I started sharing stories with friends I had long avoided opening up to, revealing pieces of myself I had carefully tucked away. Each interaction was uncomfortable. Each vulnerability was a confrontation with a part of myself I had long feared, the part that could hurt, that could fail, that could be rejected. And yet, with each moment of honesty, I felt something expand inside me, like air filling lungs that had been constricted for too long. There were setbacks. The fear was persistent. I would occasionally retreat, telling myself it was self-preservation. But the more I resisted, the more I felt the walls pressing inward, and the more I realized that avoiding discomfort was not safety, it was a slow internal death. The elite 1% do not avoid the emotional storm. They learn to walk through it, to navigate it, to emerge stronger and more present on the other side. Pain becomes a teacher, fear becomes a compass, and every crack in the wall is a passageway to something richer, something more real. One night, after a particularly long day of confronting old habits and uncomfortable truths, I found myself staring out at the city from my apartment window. The lights below shimmered like countless stories unfolding, most of them unnoticed, most of them unclaimed. And I thought about the choice that lay ahead for every senior: to shrink in the face of time and loss, or to expand, to grow, to risk, to step into the unknown with everything they had. I felt the weight of that decision pressing on me, not as a threat, but as a call. It was in that quiet, heavy moment that I truly understood the significance of the emotional wall. The 1% of seniors who take the step before 2026 are not defined by physical strength or wealth, but by their courage to dismantle the barriers within themselves. They choose to feel, to care, to connect, to risk heartbreak, to embrace the uncertainty of being alive. They understand that the first step toward becoming truly present is often the hardest: acknowledging the wall, facing the fear it hides, and deciding despite everything to move forward anyway. And as I sat there, the city breathing quietly beneath me, I made a promise to myself: I would stop hiding. I would let the walls crumble. I would risk, I would fail, I would feel. Because if I didn't, the world I had spent a lifetime watching would pass me by, and I would never know the power of what it truly means to be alive. Once I began letting the walls fall, I started to notice life in ways I hadn't for decades. It wasn't the kind of noticing that comes from observation or curiosity alone, it was immersion. The elite 1% of seniors I had been studying didn't just dabble or dip their toes in. They plunged fully into whatever caught their attention, whether it terrified them or thrilled them. I remember watching a man in his late 70s sitting on a park bench, completely absorbed in feeding the pigeons, not distracted by his phone, not conscious of the passerby's gaze, not performing for anyone, just him and the small, chaotic life at his feet. There was a precision to his attention, a devotion to the moment that made me stop dead in my tracks. I realized then that presence is a radical act. I began seeking it myself. A cup of coffee became an entire meditation. A walk through the city became an adventure, noticing textures, sounds, and faces that I had long ignored. Even mundane tasks, the act of cooking, arranging books on a shelf, writing a note, became exercises in focus, in appreciation, in being alive. And I felt the stirrings of something extraordinary, the realization that the time I had once wasted worrying about past failures or protecting myself from pain could be redirected into sheer, unfiltered engagement with life. This was not easy. Each moment of presence demanded vulnerability. It demanded that I let go of my need to be seen as competent, as strong, as composed. It demanded that I allow discomfort, uncertainty, and even fear to exist alongside joy and wonder. I could no longer hide behind my routines, my carefully constructed defenses, or the accomplishments that once defined me. Presence required total honesty with myself, and that is why most people never achieve it. Most are unwilling to confront the rawness of their own existence, unwilling to risk feeling too much. But those in the elite 1% take this risk again and again, choosing engagement over safety, curiosity over certainty, life over mere survival. I started small, attending an improvisation class for seniors, something I had never imagined myself doing. My first attempts were awkward, fumbling, painful. But in that vulnerability, I discovered the thrill of being fully alive, the kind of electricity that no amount of success, fame, or comfort could ever replicate. Each session became an act of defiance against age, against fear, against the world's insistence that I slow down, shrink, and fade. Every laugh, every stumble, every moment of connection with my classmates reinforced a simple truth: to inhabit life fully, you must be willing to be seen at your most human. The elite 1% don't simply survive, they thrive by expanding their capacity to feel, to act, to grow. They understand that aging is not a signal to retreat, but an opportunity to engage with life in a way that only comes with accumulated experience. They move with intention, live with courage, and embrace the full spectrum of existence. And slowly, I felt myself becoming one of them, learning that the radical act of presence is not about what you do in the world, but how fully you allow yourself to exist within it. By the time the sun set over the city skyline, painting the streets in long shadows and warm gold, I understood that presence was the first step, the cornerstone of the step before 2026. Without it, curiosity and courage would falter. Without it, the walls would rebuild themselves, and the possibility of true growth would vanish. And I knew then, with a clarity that felt almost sacred, that embracing presence was both terrifying and exhilarating. The beginning of a journey that would demand everything I had and give back far more than I could have imagined. The moment arrived quietly, without fanfare or warning, the kind of moment that sneaks up on you while you're staring at the edges of your own life and wondering if there's anything left worth risking. I had been walking along a narrow trail in the hills just outside the city, the air crisp with early morning frost and the kind of stillness that only exists before the sun fully wakes. The world seemed suspended, as though holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. And I realized with sudden clarity that the step, the radical act that only the elite 1% of seniors would take before 2026 was not about an achievement or a public declaration. It was about choice. About daring to inhabit life fully when society had told you to step aside. I stopped mid-step, letting the cold seep through my shoes, and thought about everything I had learned, the losses, the grief, the years spent hiding behind walls of routine and self-preservation. All of it had led to this threshold, the edge of something simultaneously terrifying and exhilarating. This step demanded exposure, vulnerability, and courage, not just courage in the way we often imagine it, but a deep existential courage, the willingness to risk irrelevance, failure, and even humiliation. In order to live authentically, it begins simply, almost imperceptibly. I reached out to someone I had avoided for decades, a former colleague, someone I had admired but also feared confronting. The call itself was clumsy at first, filled with awkward pauses and unpracticed words. But as we talked, the conversation transformed into something neither of us could have predicted: honesty, shared memory, mutual recognition. I felt a crack open inside me, a release of tension I hadn't known I'd been holding for years. That crack became a doorway. Over the following weeks, I noticed the pattern repeating in my life. I said yes to invitations I would have once declined, asked questions I feared I already knew the answers to, and engaged with the world without the filters of caution or ego. Each time, the same subtle miracle occurred: a deepening sense of aliveness, a widening of perspective, a reminder that even in later life, the capacity to grow and transform is vast, almost limitless. The step before 2026 was not a single event, it was a series of deliberate, conscious acts that refused to allow age to dictate the terms of existence. I met other seniors along the way who were doing the same. Quietly radical things that would never make headlines, but that reshaped the texture of their days. One woman at the community center had taken up classical piano at 73, learning compositions she had adored as a child but never dared attempt. A man had started mentoring young entrepreneurs, not for recognition or compensation, but to pass on the lessons of failure, resilience, and courage he had accumulated over decades. And they all shared the same spark, the same intensity I had begun to feel in myself: the refusal to shrink, the insistence on being fully present, the deliberate choice to expand their lives rather than contract. The first time I truly recognized myself as one of the elite 1% was a moment both intimate and shocking. I was performing a small improvisational piece in front of an audience of strangers, fully exposed, unsure of the outcome. And yet, instead of fear, I felt exhilaration. I was alive in a way that I hadn't been since long before my losses, long before the routines, long before the walls. I had stepped, fully and irrevocably, into the territory most of my peers never dared to enter. That step was not about applause or recognition, it was about claiming the life that had always been waiting for me, the life that refused to be ignored or diminished by age, expectation, or fear. Once the first step had been taken, the transformation began quietly but relentlessly, like sunlight seeping through cracks in a long-shuttered room. Life no longer felt like a series of routines to be endured, it became a series of invitations, each one a chance to stretch, to feel, to engage fully. I noticed the change in the small things first: how deeply I could listen to someone else's story without needing to offer advice or judgment, how a shared meal could feel like a sacred act instead of a perfunctory necessity, how even a simple walk through the city streets could reveal endless layers of wonder when approached with attention and curiosity. The elite 1% of seniors move in a different rhythm. They are not defined by what they have lost, by the years behind them, or by the expectations the world still clings to. They are defined by the courage to remain fluid, to embrace discomfort, to learn, and to love without hesitation. I saw it in myself: the ability to act boldly in personal and professional life, the readiness to dive into unfamiliar territory, the sense of freedom that came from no longer needing approval or validation. Each interaction, each choice, each tiny act of presence became a thread weaving a tapestry of life richer than I had imagined possible at this stage. Relationships deepened. I became more willing to share my thoughts, my fears, my uncertainties, without the shields that had once protected me from vulnerability. And as I did, people responded with honesty and warmth I hadn't dared hope for. Friends became confidants, colleagues became collaborators, and even casual acquaintances became reminders of the humanity that connects us all. I realized that the act of stepping fully into life does not just change the individual, it transforms the environment around them, creating ripples of authenticity, courage, and generosity that others cannot help but feel. Purpose sharpened. It was no longer abstract or distant. It was immediate and tangible. I began mentoring, teaching, and sharing experiences in ways I had avoided for fear of being misunderstood or judged. I learned that the wisdom of age is not merely a collection of memories, it is a living resource, a tool that, when wielded consciously, can uplift others, inspire growth, and even save someone from a mistake that could haunt them for years. The 1% understand that the value of life is not measured in accumulation, but in contribution, not in appearances, but in depth, not in what is seen, but in what is felt and shared. And yet, the transformation was not without friction. Old habits still pressed, old fears surfaced in moments of doubt, but I had learned to recognize them as echoes of a life that had protected itself too long. I confronted them, sometimes faltering, sometimes failing, but always returning to the choice that had set me on this path: to expand, to remain present, to risk, to love, to engage, to grow. By the time I reflected on these months of change, I saw clearly why so few take this path. It is easier to shrink, to comply, to fade quietly into the background. But those who refuse the elite one discover something extraordinary: that age is not a cage, that loss is not a sentence, that fear is not a prison. The step before 2026, I realized, is not a single action. It is a sustained commitment to live fully, to embrace complexity, and to remain relentlessly curious and compassionate, regardless of what has been lost or what the world expects. In this ongoing transformation, I felt a quiet thrill, the sense that the most meaningful chapters of life may still be unwritten. And for the first time in decades, I understood that being alive in the fullest sense is not a privilege of youth, but a reward for those willing to take the step, however late it may come. The revelation arrived not with fanfare, but with a stillness that felt almost sacred, as if the world itself were holding its breath. After decades of loss, grief, and quiet retreat, after years of observing the subtle brilliance of the elite 1% of seniors, I finally understood the full scope of the step before 2026 and why so few would dare to take it. It was not a skill to learn, a wealth to acquire, or a performance to perfect. It was something far more profound, something almost terrifying in its simplicity: the willingness to embrace the totality of one's existence, unfiltered, unapologetic, and fully alive, and to use it in service of life itself. I remember sitting on a worn wooden bench overlooking the river, the water reflecting the late afternoon sun like molten gold. Alexandra had joined me, and we were silent, each lost in thought, each aware that something monumental had shifted beneath the surface of our lives. I thought about the seniors I had watched, the ones who painted, who taught, who laughed at fear and failure alike. I thought about the walls I had torn down, the presence I had cultivated, the vulnerabilities I had dared to expose. And then it became clear: the step before 2026 is a radical declaration that life, even in its final chapters, is not a story to be endured, but a story to be authored with courage, curiosity, and love. What separates the elite 1% is not physical strength, not fortune, not fame. It is audacity. The audacity to refuse invisibility, to refuse the slow fading into quiet resignation. The audacity to let loss and grief fuel compassion rather than fear, to let age be a lens of freedom rather than limitation, to let each moment, even the painful ones, serve a greater purpose. It is the audacity to live, fully and deliberately, when society insists you shrink, slow down, and become small. I understood then why only 1% of seniors take the step. It is not easy to confront decades of habit, fear, and self-protection. It is exhausting to face grief that never truly goes away and to walk forward anyway. It is frightening to step into vulnerability after a lifetime of control. And yet, those who do it discover the secret the rest of the world often misses. Life expands when you refuse to let fear define it. Love deepens when you refuse to let loss shut you down. Joy becomes richer when you let sorrow remind you how precious each moment is. The step before 2026 is not an act, it is a transformation, a commitment. A refusal to be anything less than fully human. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of violet and crimson, I felt a rush of clarity. The step is available to anyone willing to take it, but most will not. They will cling to comfort, to familiarity, to safety. The elite 1% do not. They leap into uncertainty with open hearts, harnessing their accumulated wisdom, their scars, their losses, and their insights. And they become something extraordinary, not just survivors of time, but thrivers, teachers, and catalysts for those around them. I rose from the bench and felt the river wind on my face, cold but alive. I understood in that exact moment that the world does not need more cautious elders. It needs the brave ones, the audacious ones, the ones willing to step fully into the light of their own lives, and by doing so, illuminate the path for everyone else. And that is the final, shocking truth. The step before 2026 is not about achieving more, it is about becoming more. More fully human, more fearless, more luminous, more present. The elite 1% will take this step, and the rest will watch, wondering what they missed. But those who dare will discover something life-changing: the freedom, the power, and the grace that comes from refusing to shrink. And in that refusal, in that fearless embrace of life itself, they will find a radiance that no loss, no age, and no fear can ever diminish.